So Genesis 42 and 44 through to verse 7 of 45. When Jacob learned there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I've heard there is grain down in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold all the grain to its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You've come here to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies." "No," he said to them, "you've come to see where our land is unprotected." But they replied, "Your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who lived in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." Joseph said to them, "It is just as I told you, you are spies. This is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place until your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And he put them all in custody for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and get grain and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die." This they proceeded to do. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an account for his blood." They didn't realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep. But then he came back and spoke to them again. He had taken Simeon from them and bound before their eyes. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in the sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and he saw the silver in the mouth of the sack. "My silver has been returned," he said to the brothers. "Here it is in my sack." Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling and said, "What is this that God has done to us?" When they came back to their father in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them. They said, "The man who is Lord over the land spoke harshly to us and treated us as though we were spying on the land. But we said to him, 'We are honest men, we are not spies. We were 12 brothers, sons of one father. One is no more, and the youngest is now with our father in Canaan.' Then the man who is Lord over the land said to us, 'This is how I will know whether you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here and take food for your starving households and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, so that I will know that you are not spies but honest men. Then I will give you your brother back, and you can trade in the land.' As they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver. When they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. Their father Jacob said to them, 'You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." Then Reuben said to his father, "You may put both my sons to death if I do not bring them back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back." But Jacob said, "My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my grey head down to the grave in sorrow." Now Joseph gave these instructions to the steward of his house. "Fill the men's sacks with as much food as they can carry, and put each man's silver in the mouth of the sack. Then put my cup, the silver one, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, along with the silver for his grain." And he did as Joseph said. As morning dawned, the men were sent on their way with their donkeys. They had not gone far from the city when Joseph said to his steward, "Go after those men at once, and when you catch them, say to them, 'Why have you repaid good with evil? Isn't this cup my master drinks from, and also uses for divination? This is a wicked thing you have done.'" When he caught up with them, he repeated these words to them. But they said, Why does my Lord say such things? Far be it from your servants to do anything like that. We even brought back to you from the land of Canaan the silver we found inside the mouths of our sacks. Why would we steal silver and gold from your master's house? If any of your servants is found to have done it, he will die, and the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves." "Very well," they said. "Let it be as you say. Whoever is found to have it will become my slave. The rest of you will be free from blame." Each of them quickly lowered the sack to the ground and opened it. Then the steward proceeded to search, beginning with the eldest and ending with the youngest. And the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. At this they tore their clothes. Then they all loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. Joseph was sitting in the house when Judah and his brothers came in, and they threw themselves to the ground before him. Joseph said to them, "What is this you have done? Don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination?" "What can we say to my lord?" Judah replied. "What can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my lord's slaves, we ourselves and the one who was found to have the cup." But Joseph said, "Far be it from me to do such a thing. Only the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you go back to your father in peace." Then Judah went to him and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord. Let me speak a word to my lord. Do not be angry at your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself. My lord asked his servants, 'Do you have a father or a brother?' And we answered, 'We have an aged father, and there is a young son born to him in his old age. His brother is dead, and he is the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him.' Then you said to your servants, 'Bring him down to me so that I can see him for myself.' And we said to my lord, 'The boy cannot leave his father. If he leaves him, his father will die.' But you told your servants, 'Unless your younger brother comes down with you, you will not see my face again.' When we went back to your servant, my father, we told him what the Lord had said. Our father said, 'Go back and buy a little more food.' But we said, 'We cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us will we go down. We cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us.' Your servant, my father, said to us, 'You know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away from me, and I said, "He has surely been torn to pieces," and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, harm will come to him. You will bring my grey hair down to the grave in misery. So now, if the boy is not with us when we go back to your servant my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servant will bring the grey head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame for you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see misery that would come on my father. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Make everyone leave my presence." So there is no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph came to his brothers. "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. And now do not be distressed, do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me here ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. We don't normally do this, but why don't you stand up and have a stretch and a yawn for a moment. All right, you can take a seat. Now, I would love it if you could have your Bibles open to that general section of Genesis. Some of you may have been wondering why there were gaps in the story. What's going on? Where are we up to? We're going to cover a fair bit of stuff, so I'll point you to certain verses to have a look at as we go along. So do have that part of Genesis from about kind of chapter 42 or so onwards. Let's pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So we're getting close to the end of our journey through the first book in the Bible. But I want us to jump ahead to the last book in the Bible, where one of the elders in heaven says to the Apostle John in Revelation 5 verse 5, "Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has conquered." And Jesus is the Lion of Judah. You'd think of all of Jacob's sons, it would actually be Joseph, who would be the one whose name was linked to King Jesus. But as we read the story, that admittedly does seem to be all about Joseph. We see one of the reasons why Jesus is called the Lion of Judah and not the Lion of Joseph. Now, teenagers, if you're using one of the sermon sheets, there's 2 words today, and they are substitute and guarantee. Substitute and guarantee. So why is Jesus the Lion of the tribe of Judah and not of the tribe of Joseph? I mean, Joseph is the focus of the last main section of Genesis, and he does look like the ideal leader and hero for God's people. He comes off, you have to admit it, looking a whole lot better than Judah does, certainly at the start of the story. Judah and Joseph were both sons of Jacob. Judah was Jacob's 4th son by his wife Leah, but Joseph was Jacob's favourite son by his favourite wife Rachel. And Joseph is the central human character in Genesis 37 all the way through to 50, not Judah. Remember from chapter 37 that Judah and his brothers were jealous of Joseph. They hated him because his father loved him more than them. And his dreams didn't help. I mean, no brother likes to be told that he's going to be bowing down to his little brother. And they hated Joseph so much that they sold him into slavery and they told his father that he was dead. But even in slavery and then in prison, God was with Joseph and his favour was on him. And then in chapter 41, he interpreted the dreams of two of Pharaoh's servants who'd fallen foul of their master. And then eventually, after 2 long years, that led to him interpreting Pharaoh's dreams and being put in charge of the whole nation of Egypt, which brought him and his brothers back together again. And that's sort of where we pick up the story. Yet one of the most surprising and important developments during Joseph's life, which has massive implications for the history of God's people and for the king who God would eventually send for his people, is what happened to Joseph's brother, Judah. In fact, I want to say that the climax of the whole book of Genesis comes as Joseph and Judah come face to face at the end of chapter 44. So this morning, let's take a fresh look at this story. It's one that's probably well known to many of us. A lot of us are going to be familiar with it, but let's take a fresh look, and also a fresh look at Judah, because he certainly left us with a bad impression after his story in chapter 38 last week. And there are 3 things that I want us to remember about Judah and to see in Judah in this story of Joseph. The first is that, yes, Judah was a deeply flawed human being. Not only was he one of the 10 jealous brothers who plotted against Joseph, Judah was the one who suggested the idea that they sell him into slavery. What will we gain? Or perhaps better, what will we profit if we kill our brother and cover up his blood, says Judah. Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let's not just get rid of him. Let's make a profit out of it. Last week in chapter 38, we saw Judah nurturing toxic sin in his own life and letting it run wild throughout his family with horrific consequences. But the fact that that story is there at that point, almost kind of interrupting the Joseph story, gives us the hint that Judah will in fact be very significant as the bigger story kind of unfolds. And there are at least 2 reasons, I think, for Judah's story to pop up just as Joseph's story is getting started. The obvious one we saw last Sunday is to contrast Judah on one hand and Joseph on the other. Judah in Genesis 38 spiralling downwards, and Joseph in Genesis 39 flourishing in Potiphar's house as his godly, righteous character shines through. Joseph and Judah's lives go in the opposite direction, but there is a second reason that we might miss when we first read those 2 contrasting stories. They prepare us for what we see in Judah in chapters 43 and 44. So yes, the first thing that we remember about Judah is that he was a deeply flawed human being. But the second thing that we remember is that Judah was willing to make his own life a guarantee for the life of his brother. In chapter 42, when the famine was getting really bad, Jacob sent all of his remaining sons, except Benjamin, to Egypt to buy food for his family, to keep them alive. And Joseph, by then, was lord of all Egypt. He recognised his brothers, but they had no idea who he was. He sent them home, loaded up with food, he even gave them their silver back, but he kept Simeon with him, telling the others they had to come back with their younger brother Benjamin, who was actually Joseph's only full brother, the only other son of his mother Rachel. But Jacob, having already lost one son, one of his favourite sons, said that there was no way that he was going to risk Benjamin too, at which point Judah stepped forward in a critical moment. And notice the difference between what Judah offered and what his brother Reuben had offered earlier. So in chapter 42, verse 37, Reuben asked Jacob for the first time to send Benjamin so that the family could get more food, and he made a pledge. He said this: "You may put both of my sons to death, but I do not bring him back to you." Quite wisely, Jacob was not having a bar of that, because essentially what he was looking at was losing a son and 2 grandsons at that point. And he said, "No, I will not trust you with my son Benjamin. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my grey head down to the grave in sorrow. But things were getting really bad. The whole family were not far off starving to death. And so in chapter 43, which we didn't read, chapter 43 verses 8 and 9, Judah offered his father a different guarantee of safety for Benjamin. So have a look at chapter 43, starting at verse 8. This is what Judah says. Send the boy along with me, and we will go at once, so that we and you and our children may live and not die. I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life. So Judah was offering his life as a guarantee for Benjamin's life, a pledge of safety for Benjamin. And Jacob reluctantly agreed. He entrusted Benjamin to Judah, and so all of the brothers went back down to Egypt, where Joseph entertained them in his own home, giving Benjamin a portion 5 times bigger than his brothers at the meal. And then in chapter 44, he sent them home again with their saddlebags full of food. This time, however, they hadn't got very far before an Egyptian official caught up with them and accused them of stealing Joseph's silver cup, the cup that Joseph himself had planted there. To their horror, it was found in Benjamin's pack. And so he was condemned, and they all had to return to Egypt as slaves. Now, there are 2 big questions that I think we want to ask at this point. First, why did Joseph give Benjamin 5 times the portion of his brothers? 5 times more food to eat at dinner. And second, why did he hide the silver cup in his pack? And I think the answer to both of those questions may well be that Joseph was setting up a test for his brothers. See, with Joseph gone, Benjamin, the only other son of Rachel, had become his father's favourite. And now Benjamin was being favoured by this prince of Egypt. So it looks like Joseph wanted to see if his brothers would be jealous and mistreat Benjamin like they'd envied and mistreated him all those years before. Then in chapter 44, verse 5, we're told that the cup that was hidden in the sack was the one that Joseph used for divination, or seeking the mind of God, or telling the future, if you like. Would the brothers think that Benjamin now wanted to be the dreamer in the family, like his long-lost brother? It seems as if Joseph wanted to see if anything had changed in his family. Would his brothers abandon Benjamin just like they abandoned him 22 years earlier? Well, Jacob's sons were forced to go back to the city and to face the music. And did you notice in verses 13 and 14 of chapter 44 that there is a hint of the central role that Judah is about to play? Verse 13, at this, they tore their clothes. Then they loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. Joseph was still in the house when Judah and his brothers came in, and they threw themselves to the ground before him. So Judah was about to emerge as the key brother, and he steps forward to give the longest speech in the whole of the book of Genesis. And it is in fact the climax of the whole book. Take a look at what he says in verses 32 to 33. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. Judah's willingness to sacrifice himself, to take his brother's place, to be abandoned instead of Benjamin, turned everything on its head. Chapter 45, verse 1, Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with him when Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And this has got to be one of the most dramatic and emotional moments in the Bible. I am Joseph. And his brothers were terrified. This couldn't be good news after what they'd done to him. And now he had the power to crush them. But instead, he comforted them. He threw his arms around them. He comforted them not by telling them what a good guy he was, but by pointing 5 times to God's good and sovereign purposes in their evil. Read with me from chapter 4 of verse 45. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no ploughing and reaping, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me and don't delay.'" Joseph is totally God-centered. In chapter 50, verse 20, he sums up the whole story in one sentence. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." What a difference it makes when we are mistreated to see God's good work despite and through the sin of those who are hurting us. Now, that God intended it for good doesn't mean that the brothers' actions weren't evil. They were. They were responsible for what they did. "What you did to me was evil," says Joseph, "and you meant it to be evil." And yet, as we read God's word, we see over and over again that when human beings set out to do evil, God shows himself to be in full and absolute control. He is sovereign over every situation and every detail. Human sin and human evil do not frustrate his purposes, but astonishingly and amazingly, he takes the very acts and intentions of evil people and brings about his saving and good purposes for his creation. And that is exactly what he did, so gloriously and so powerfully, with his own son at the cross. I mean, Joseph's brothers must have been beside themselves with fear, but he comforted them by telling them that he could see what God was doing for good when they intended evil. And because of his God-centeredness, he was able to genuinely forgive their evil intentions and their sin against him. If the whole business of the 5 times bigger meal and the cup in Benjamin's bag was Joseph testing his brothers, then when Judah stepped forward to offer himself in Benjamin's place, he passed the test with flying colours. Judah's willingness to take the blame for his brother demonstrated love instead of jealousy and showed Joseph that Judah at least had changed. He was not the same man he had been 22 years before. Judah offered himself as a substitute. His freedom for Benjamin's freedom. His life for Benjamin's life. And that, rather than his sin, is his legacy in God's great salvation story. We remember Judah's terrible flaws, and we see his willingness to be a substitute. And so thirdly, we should be amazed by his legacy. When Jacob was about to die, and he was giving his blessing to his sons. In Genesis 49, he said that the kingship of Israel would belong to Judah and his line, not to the elders, then not to Joseph, who seems like the obvious choice and whose story is so prominent. He says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. Now, this was not where Judah was heading at the end of chapter 38. But he offered himself as a substitute for his brother. He became a guarantee of safety for Benjamin. He was prepared to sacrifice everything in order to put Benjamin's well-being ahead of his own. And that is the kind of men and women God has called us to be. Willing to sacrifice our freedom, our rights, our comfort, our future, even maybe our lives for our brothers and sisters. And we can do that because we have a king who has done it for us. God's plan was that Israel's king would be a guarantee of safety for his people. And that's Judah's legacy. That's what he should be remembered for. That is the kind of king who would be born of the line of Judah. Judah offered himself to free his brother rather than enslave him. This is the kind of king that God would send his people. And that is our guarantee of safety. You and I are no less flawed than Judah was, but we have hope in spite of that. A king has come in the line of Judah who has offered himself as the guarantee for our safety. A king to take our place, a king to bear our blame. There is only one king, and there is only one man who is the perfect embodiment of Judah's legacy. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He has triumphed. Before the creation of the world, Jesus said to the Father about us, I will be the guarantee of their safety. I will not come back without them. I will bear the blame for them. And Jesus came and he offered himself in our place as our substitute. And you can love others like that too. You can have a share in Judah's legacy when you know the joy of having Jesus as your guarantee of eternal safety. He is the Lion of Judah who has triumphed. He will hold us fast. He will keep us safe. And he will bring us home to the Father.